Let me talk to David Dollar now from the Brookings Institution here in Washington. He's a senior fellow at John L. Thornton China Center. David, welcome. If this inquiry, if you will, leads to some kind of official investigation and that ends up with more tariffs or perhaps some kind of sanctions, what will this mean for future of trade between the world's two biggest economies?
Well, I think the big news here is that the Trump administration has taken a step back. As you pointed out in your commentary, the original plan was to launch a 301 investigation. Now this executive memo is basically asking the trade representative to study whether or not to launch an investigation. So it puts it all on a much longer timetable. But if the U.S. proceeds with this 301, it's probably going to find some Chinese practices that it disagrees with. Then it's going to face the tough decision of what to do. So definitely it could lead to a trade war, and that would be lose-lose for both sides. Lots of different interest groups in the U.S. would lose. It would be bad for China. It would be bad for the global economy. So there are lots of voices urging the Trump administration not to go down the road of launching a trade war.
You mentioned Section 301. Perhaps you can explain in simple terms to our viewers what that means.
I think the simple way to put it is before the WTO was formed about 20 years ago, this was an important part of U.S. law. The U.S. could use it against countries that were pursuing unfair trade practices. It fell into disuse after the WTO came into existence because now if there's a trade dispute, we can take our other countries to the WTO. So it's kind of going back in time to launch a 301. And it reflects a lack of confidence in the WTO and a willingness to go it alone.
You bring up an important point. Let me tell you what Beijing is saying about all this. They released a statement saying, if you're a member of the World Trade Organization, you should resolve trade disputes there. Don't use a unilateral system where there's no mediation. Do they have a point here?
Yeah, they have a point, that in general, we have a trade system that works quite well. And if you have disagreements, you should go to the WTO. But the U.S. side also has a point that China has a lot of restrictions in place that are consistent with its WTO accession agreement. And it's been hard to get China to open up more. So this is definitely a political ploy, or you might call it leverage, trying to get China to open up more. Hopefully the two sides will talk, and hopefully China will open up more, which would be in its own interest. And then that would help diffuse this tension.
And there's plenty of tension on the Korean Peninsula, David. Could this impact the relationship between Beijing and Washington on other issues like the crisis with DPRK?
Well, I think Korea's already had a big effect because the original leaked rumor was that the U.S. was going to launch an investigation and do it last week. And the U.S. held off clearly because of the UN Security Council deliberations. And as I said, they've now taken a big step backwards. This is kind of a compromise. It's a nod to Trump's base that he's talking about doing something about China, but he's not really doing anything here. He's just asking one of his agencies to do a study. So I think that North Korea is already looming over this. If the U.S. and China can cooperate on North Korea, Trump has been very frank that that's going to affect his attitude about China trade.
All right, we'll leave it there. David Dollar from the Brookings Institution. Thank you so much, sir.